The next stop on our family's round-the-world journey was Sri Lanka. And honestly, Sri Lanka was a bit difficult for us. We wondered at times if we would keep traveling for the whole year or if maybe we shouldn't head home early. But this is our story of Sri Lanka. And it's mostly in photographs. After 6 months in Southeast Asia, we hopped on a plane and we flew to Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka. From Colombo, our plan was to make our way south to a city named Galle, and the best way to get from Colombo to Galle is on a train. So we got to the train station early, and even though the train was packed with people, I got a nice seat and got to look out the window for the ride from Colombo to Galle. So we got settled in and started exploring right away. Part of Galle is a bustling, hectic city. It's colorful and crowded, but the old fort part of the city has little streets lined with shops. It's lit up at night. The storefronts are often colorful and crumbling, and it's beautiful and atmospheric. It's this amazing mix of chaos and beauty. There's a well-known, beautiful lighthouse. There's old, crumbling churches. And we got our first glimpses of kids playing cricket in the street. And the sunsets were beautiful. In the evenings, we would gather along with pretty much everybody else who was in Galle to watch the sun drop down into the ocean. Sometimes members of the local peacock population would join us as well. And Galle was where we came to fear and loathe the dreaded tuk-tuk driver of Sri Lanka. I don't think there was a single time we got into a tuk-tuk or a taxi in Sri Lanka where the driver didn't stop halfway to our destination and try to renegotiate the price that we had agreed on, sometimes extremely aggressively. Now, this isn't unique to Sri Lanka by any means, but it was worse in Sri Lanka than we had experienced anywhere else, by far. Before long, it was time for us to make our way to our next destination, a city to the north called Kandy. Again, we took the train, and this time the train was far more crowded. We ended up standing for most of the trip, but towards the end we got a little space and I even got to get my head out the window. Kandy was an interesting city. In the park in the middle of the city, there were large monitor lizards, beautiful intricate trees, turtles. It was a wonderful time, so relaxed. Whoa! That guy waiting in ambush? Oh, that's creepy. Whoa, that's creepy too. No, wait. Okay, ready? Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weekend weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. Right? Get it? Because, there's like the ravens and... okay, back to the story. So, Kandy is a really important religious center. One of the most holy sites in Buddhism, the Temple of the Tooth, is located there. This Buddha sits overlooking the town, and there were monks throughout the city. Kandy also has a vibrant, chaotic part, full of color and people and life. We were actually in Kandy for Christmas Eve, and we celebrated with some Pizza Hut and also with just enough internet to watch A Christmas Story. Almost everywhere we went in Sri Lanka, we had really bad internet, and every hotel told us the same thing. Wow, you just missed it. The last tourist here used up the last of our internet for the month. Sorry. But we had a very Merry Christmas. But then it was time for us to go. Our next stop was the town of Ella. To get to Ella, we had to ride the most crowded train I have ever been on in my entire life. Lonely Planet says, sometimes there's no way to get a seat on the slow but oh so popular train to Ella. But with a prime standing room only spot looking out at the rolling carpet of tea, who cares? Well, I'll tell you who cares. At one point, as I stood there on that train, people packed in around me, my knee started to ache. To stretch it a little bit, I bent my knee, lifting my foot off the floor for just a second. But when I went to put my foot back down, other people's feet had taken up all the space. There was no room left. I stood for more than 5 minutes on one foot because I only had enough floor space for one foot. That's how crowded this train was. So the Lonely Planet quote also suggests that at least while you're packed in here like a human sardine, you get this wonderful view, and that should make it all worth it, right? Yeah, well, the windows are low enough that if you're taller than about 3.5 feet, you don't get any view out the window while you are standing up. So it's pretty clear that whoever wrote this quote had never been on the train to Ella. So hey, Lonely Planet, this is for you. Make sure you've been to the places that you write about in your guidebooks. Eventually, we got to Ella. And walking out into the fresh air, the stress of the train ride was cleared away from me almost immediately. Ella sits in rolling tea fields, dotted with trees. It's a beautiful location. We got to get out and take some hikes. And after spending a lot of time in cities on this trip, it was great to be back in a more natural environment again. But the whole time we were there, the weather was pretty bad, and it kept us inside for quite a bit of time. The girls painted their fingernails, and we played a lot of cards. And we ate mountains of roti, whether it was fresh or whether it was gotu, which is day-old roti, which is chopped up and fried with chilies and vegetables, and what fried rice is to leftover rice, gotu is to leftover roti. After a few days, it was time for us to make our way to our next destination. So we caught a bus to Tissa, where we hired a driver to take us on a safari in Yala National Park. The main thing we wanted to see in Yala was leopards, so we piled into a truck along with pretty much everybody else in Tissa. We went to places like this, which our driver assured us was great leopard habitat, but no leopards, and this also great leopard habitat, and we didn't see any leopards. We saw lots of birds. Beautiful birds, colorful birds, birds of prey. Birds were everywhere. And the first time we saw a wild peacock strut out in front of us, it was something special. The bright color of this majestic bird, it's so beautiful, and it was wonderful to see one in the wild. But you see a lot of peacocks in Yala National Park. By the time we were just a few hours into our safari, the peacocks had lost some of their allure. But they are beautiful. Yala was the first place that our family ever saw wild elephants. And hey, any leopards out there interested in some nice fresh venison? Yeah? No takers? Oh, okay, what about some pork? Anybody want some pork? Yala was also the first place we were ever stuck in a traffic jam because a crocodile had crawled onto the road and wouldn't move. And maybe it was the first place where an elephant had watched us from the bush. And can you believe these guys? It's like, oh, I'm a cormorant. I can swim underwater, but my feathers get all wet, so I have to stand and hold my wings out. I'm not showing off my beautiful black shiny feathers. It's just, I have to do this. It's like the Instagrammers of birds. We also saw an Alexandrian parrot. Super cute little birds flying around Yala. And I was a huge Rikki Tikki Tavi fan as a kid, so love mongoose. We had a great time cruising around in our open truck. We mostly cruised around. There were some issues, but, that's just part of the adventure of it all, right? We got through and no leopards came and ate us while we were stuck. We got to push our boundaries by doing things like touching cacti. We made little hearts with our shadows. And we got to see what our feet look like in sand. That was pretty cool. And then it was time for us to move on. Our next stop was a beach town called Marissa. We had a bit of a hard time finding a place to stay in Marissa. I think we visited every hotel in the city. We eventually ended up here, and from them we heard the same thing that we heard from most hotels while we were in Sri Lanka. Ooh, I'm sorry, the internet is all out. The previous guests used up the last of the internet, and the previous guests used up the last of the hot water, and the previous guests used up the last of my patience. In the evenings, impromptu seafood restaurants would set up on the beach, and you could walk down and point to the fish you wanted, and they would grill it up for you. But like most things in Sri Lanka, we found the value wasn't good, and the times that we did eat there, they tended to overcook the fish. One of the highlights of our time in Marissa was a whale watching tour. We loaded onto a boat, took motion sickness pills, and headed out in search of blue whales. Before we spotted any blue whales, an orca surfaced right next to the boat and swam along beside us for several minutes. Eventually, though, the blue whales showed up. They don't jump in the air like humpbacks do, but we can see their back, and just seeing their back, you can tell that these animals are huge. We saw their tails too, and sadly they never turned to get a really good angle for the tail, but seeing blue whales was absolutely amazing. I also knew that while we were in Marissa, I wanted to visit the stilt fishermen of Sri Lanka. This is a practice that started during World War II, when food shortages and overcrowded fishing areas led some fishermen to resort to putting poles in the ground and fishing from those poles. Today, the fishermen aren't actually fishing, and it's mostly for tourists' sake. You have to give them a little bit of money and they go out and pretend like they're fishing for you. Some people get all up in arms about it being not authentic. I don't know that that matters too much to me. It made for some amazing photography, and they stayed on those poles for me until the sun went down, the light turned blue, and I was able to make a long exposure to make the water look silky. And these are some of my favorite pictures from our whole time in Sri Lanka. Another thing we wanted to do was visit one of the turtle hatcheries. Several different species of sea turtles live in the waters around Sri Lanka. At night, the turtles will come on shore, dig a hole, and lay their eggs. But the busy beaches of Sri Lanka aren't a safe place for those eggs to hatch, so workers go out, dig up the eggs, and bring them back to hatcheries where they bury them and let them hatch there. So they end up with a ton of super cute little sea turtles. They also keep older turtles that for one reason or another can't go back out into the wild. We visited one of these hatcheries and had a wonderful time. We spent some time on the beach in Marissa as well, and even got in some surfing, although it's difficult for people who live in Hawaii to not go abroad, visit a beach, and compare it to the beach that is 2 minutes from your house. We certainly did some of that. And once again, we spent a good deal of time playing cards. And the food in Marissa, well, it was fine, but it got very monotonous, and we ended up quite tired of it. Eventually, it was time for us to get on a train, and it was not a super crowded train this time, and we headed to Colombo, the capital city of Sri Lanka. People love to hate on Colombo, but we tend to like cities, and we like Colombo just fine. The markets, the streets, the color, the smells, the energy. We just love cities, especially capital cities. We found this beautiful candy-striped mosque in the middle of the city, too. It was hard to get a good picture of. I was invited to go inside, but my wife and daughters weren't allowed to go in because women weren't allowed, so it felt a little bit weird for me to go in. It also was a little bit weird that they sold hair mayonnaise at the shop at the mosque. We also visited the Pagoda Tea Rooms. Any child of the 80s might recognize this as the place where Duran Duran filmed Hungry Like a Wolf. I really wanted to flip over a table in slow motion, but I thought I probably shouldn't. And hey, that building's got the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals listed on its panels. That's pretty cool. We had a fine time in Sri Lanka. In fact, had we gone for 2 weeks, we probably would have been pretty happy there, but a month was just too long. We got tired of the same old food. We got tired of dealing with the hotels telling us that there was no more internet, no more hot water. We got tired of the tuk-tuk drivers and cabbies trying to renegotiate every single time. Sri Lanka's fine. You should go there. We struggled with it. We felt lost. And it probably didn't help that we were ambushed both by a giant monitor lizard and by Lonely Freaking Planet.